Hello and welcome to Polaris Film School. I'm your host John Jenkins and I'm here to bring you techniques, guides, and lessons to get your career in filmmaking and photography started out. So today's lesson is going to be just some vocabulary terms to get us all on the same page, as well as to kind of build up a familiarity with them as we're going to be using them thoroughly in later lessons. The first term we're going to go over today is of course going to be the camera. So the camera is defined as any device used for recording visual information in the form of film, photography, or video signals. Basically, the way it works is light goes in through one end, and on the other end, there's a photosensitive material that records that visual information. Photosensitive material is going to be any material or surface that reacts when it's exposed to light. It's usually going to be film cellulite or a digital sensor. Now, to control your image, it's very important to be able to control how much light is actually getting to that digital sensor or film. We call this amount of light that's captured by the sensor exposure. Exposure is probably one of the most important principles when it comes to photography or cinematography. So it's important to get very familiar with it very quickly. There are three main ways for you to be able to control your exposure, and we'll go over them right now. One of the most crucial ways to control your exposure is through aperture, which is defined as a hole, opening, or gap. And we call it that because there's literally a little hole in the back of your lens that helps control how much light is getting through. Now this is very important, not just because it controls how much light comes in, but also it heavily influences what's called the depth of field. Notice how the background behind me is blurry? That's because I'm using a specific aperture on my camera to achieve that effect. This is great because it makes the background look creamy and out of focus, which puts more emphasis and focus on me. There's a couple other techniques involved, but this is a great example of why aperture is so important and learned. Aperture is measured in what's called f-stops, and we'll get into those on a more detailed level at a later lesson because it can get a little complicated a little quick. But the basics of what you need to know is aperture controls how much light is coming in as well as depth of field. And the way it works is the smaller your f-stop, the more light that's going to be let in, but the shallower your depth of field is going to be. So if you notice, if I go too close or too far away, I become out of focus. That's my depth of field. That premium spot where I'm in focus and the sharpest, that's depth of field. The relationship between your aperture and your depth of field is like this. The smaller the aperture, the more light that's going to be let in, but the shallower your depth of field is. So if you're shooting at something like an f2, f2.8, or an f4, you're going to have a much shallower depth of field if you're shooting at something like a 16, 11, or 13, where your depth of field is going to be much more broad and you'll be able to see a much more vast distance. There's a time and place for both of these techniques. Like for example, I'm shooting at an f2 right now, and this gives me a little bit of play, but I have to be kind of still because if I move too much, I'll become out of focus. But on the flip side, my background is really nice and blurry and gives me a really emphasized effect. Your aperture can also control the sharpness of your image. Now, your sharpness is going to be just how in focus something is or isn't in frame. If something is very sharp, it's very in focus. If something is very unsharp, it'll be out of focus. This goes back to your f-stop, where typically the lower f-stops are going to give you more light and be a little bit less sharp than some of the higher f-stops. So we'll do a whole breakdown on lenses and kind of go over that a little bit in more detail later. The next word we're going to go over is shutter. Shutter is going to be a physical mechanism inside of the camera, and this is going to move out of the way and expose your photosensitive material to light. We call how fast it does that the shutter speed. Shutter speed can determine what's called motion blur. Motion blur is how blurry something is when it moves across the frame. You'll notice that if I move really fast, the camera doesn't quite pick up every single motion, and there's going to be some blurs in between there if I actually freeze frame it and stop it. That's something that photographers can actually control. And in photography, the higher the number, the less motion blur you have. This is great for catching things in mid-motion or trying to have that freeze time effect. On the flip side, the longer you expose the image, of course you'll let in more light because you're opening that shutter for a physically longer period of time, but also you're going to have the potential for more motion blur. The last topic we'll be discussing is ISO. ISO is how sensitive your digital sensor or film is. ISO is usually measured in the hundreds and works something like this. Lower ISO films are usually more common and less sensitive to light. So this is something that you're going to want to use in broad daylight or when you know you're going to have plenty of ambient light. Higher ISO films are usually not as common or are more expensive and are more sensitive to light, hence the higher number. If you try to use the higher ISO films in the same settings as a lower ISO film without compensating, what's going to happen is you're going to have overexposure, because again, that higher number means it's more sensitive to light. Most cameras nowadays though are digital, so they work a little bit differently. They have what's called a native ISO, or an ISO that they'll have the best performance out of. Now, usually this is somewhere in the 400, 800 ballpark, but some cameras have dual ISO, which means that once you get further away from that ISO, it'll actually snap back and look more pristine again. You can tell when you're getting further away from ISO because you'll start to introduce what's called noise. Noise is grains, specks, or otherwise imperfections in your image that sometimes can be an aesthetic choice, but sometimes can also impede the clarity of your images. To reduce noise, you want to shoot at your native ISO. Together, aperture, shutter, and ISO all work together to properly expose your image. That's all I have time for, but thank you so much for spending some time at Polaris Film School. If you liked the video, drop a like, make sure to subscribe because we got a lot more content just like this coming right up real soon. Thanks and have a great day.